Welcome back to Too Light, Too Dark, the podcast where we explore the full spectrum of the human experience, from the bright sparks that maybe inspire us to the shadows we don't shy away from. Today, we're joined by someone who is an advocate and attorney working at the intersection of mental health, addiction, and civil liberty. His work challenging the Baker Act and supporting individuals and families in crisis has made him a compelling voice in this space. So, with these words as flowers of introduction, I'm delighted to welcome Mark Astor.
Leon, good to see you, my friend, and thank you for having me as a guest here. I'm very grateful.
I really appreciate your time, Mark. So yeah, welcome. And just to kick us off, tell us a little bit about you. What's the genesis story? What brought you into this space, Mark?
Wow, it's been a bit of a journey for me, Leon, but we're coming up on our 10th anniversary, February. It'll be 10 years since I opened up a law firm with my wife with the sole mission to save families whose loved ones are suffering from substance use, mental health disorders, and failed attempts at recovery. So for the last 10 years, we've been speaking to families from all over this country, occasionally outside of the country, and it's typically mom and dad that's calling us about adults with a long history of drug use and mental illness and treatment that doesn't seem to work. They're probably med non-compliant, and they may well have been a guest of their respective state, either through the criminal system or the mental health system, and maybe even an overdose. And they call us and say, hey, this has been going on for many, many years. We can't take it anymore. The family is all but destroyed. And we heard that you might be able to help. Is that true? And as a general rule, the answer to that is yes. But recovery is a journey, not a destination. And it takes time to get somebody well. And it also takes time for the family to heal too. So that's what we do in a nutshell.
It's really interesting, and I'm really glad that you've chosen to give some time to our podcast, because this resonates with me personally. I've been in situations before where I had an addiction that was pretty rampant. I hurt people that I loved. I've done things that I was ashamed of, but I was really lucky that I could find the NHS in this country that helped me out at first point of contact, and then the key worker, and then the sort of support around that. So I just wanted to say thanks for, I suppose, identifying that gap. Is that a good way to describe it, Mark? Maybe it's a bit too harsh, that term, right?
Well, I think what it is, so when it comes to dealing with somebody who has a behavioral health issue, a lot of the time the families will say, we don't understand why is this person that we love so much doing this to themselves? And the way I explain it is that it's as if their brain had been kidnapped. You know, that probably happened several years before. And while it looks like their loved one and sounds like their loved one and walks like their loved one, it's not their loved one. And so I share that with them because I think there's a little bit of a stigma. Well, there was a stigma attached to a behavioral health issue. I think there still is, but it's certainly better than it was. But I think that when people understand that their loved one is not capable of making the decision to save themselves, or they would do, then the issue becomes, well, who's going to make that decision for them? Is it going to be the state, either through the criminal system, because people with behavioral health issues unfortunately make silly decisions and get themselves in trouble? Or is it going to be the state through the mental health system? And here in Florida, our mental health system is draconian and very broken. So you don't want the state doing it. So if it's not going to be the state and your loved one can't make the decision, is the family willing to make the commitment to save them? And that typically requires a commitment of time, energy, and money. Well, by the time they come to us, it's been going on for a long time. Everybody's exhausted, and the family may well have spent quite a bit of money trying to solve this problem on their own. And so we're saying, well, look, hold on a second. We may have the answer for you here. Are you willing to, one, have that conversation about how we can help? And two, if we can help you, and if we can't, we'll tell them. But if we think that we have a viable option for you, are you willing to give this one more try? And so I think that is the biggest, sort of gap, as it were, is asking a family to take a bit of a leap of faith, right? Because we're going to be going into court, and it may or may not become an adversarial, situation with their loved one. And that's a big ask of a family. But when they've been going through this for a long, long time, I mean, we're at the end of the rope. That's it. I mean, this is the last chance to save this person. Otherwise, they will end up in the grips of the state, or worse, they'll end up dead. And that does happen. And sorry to tell everybody that we do have those conversations with families, and it's heartbreaking because we take the work. I wouldn't say we take it personally, but we only do one thing. I'm not a guy that's taking car accidents and divorce work and criminal cases. I do one thing here, and my team does one thing. And so, yeah, the work is important to us. So I think that's the big gap. Maybe one other big gap, Leon, I think is getting quality treatment to everybody. And I know that we sort of had a little chat about your background before we came on live here. Um, and I know in the UK we have the NHS, which and it's been a long time since I lived in the UK, but it sounds like based on what you tell me that there are still good services available for people with behavioral health issues through NHS. I mean, here in Florida, we have county facilities, but I don't think the treatment is what I would consider of quality. I mean, you get what you pay for. If you can't afford to pay anything, or there's no insurance to cover the cost of the services, then yeah, it's probably not going to be as good as if you could. And that I think is perhaps the big inequity and a gap in the ability to get somebody into recovery.
Our podcast is called Too Light, Too Dark, and it talks about, I suppose, contrasts that kind of shape a life. And it sounds like what you're trying to do kind of sits right in the middle of that sort of integration point. So you're trying to find the integration point for the individual and the family. And just looking back at some of the conversations that you've had and I've been party to and privy to, Mark, that must be really difficult for you to kind of process day on day and to give advice. Like, where do you think that drive comes from? What's the motivation for that, Mark?
Yeah, so way back when, not to age myself, but back in the 90s, I was from 94 to 99, I was prosecutor here in Palm Beach County. And you know, when I first got out of law school, because they hired me right out of law school, I was full of piss and vinegar. I was gung ho, right? Lock everybody up. But then I realized something pretty quickly, and what I realized was there was something seriously wrong with the system. Because while there were plenty of bad individuals that needed to be locked up, and I certainly locked up my fair share, there were other individuals who were coming through the court system who were coming back on a regular basis, and it was because they had an untreated behavioral health issue. Now, the mandate in Florida's criminal system, as it was back in the 90s, is to punish first and to rehabilitate second. And we even have, in felony court, uh, the statute that governs sentencing is called the punishment code. And it's called punishment code for a very good reason, because it gives the judge the authority to punish somebody to the maximum on a first offense if the judge deems that appropriate. So, I mean, we're really about potentially locking somebody up and throwing the key away. But back in the 90s, we didn't have any of these, what I call diversionary courts. There was no drug court, no mental health court, no veterans court. We had nowhere to develop people out of the criminal system, at least initially, when they weren't, maybe in felony court, where they hadn't done something so serious that they needed to be locked up. But now we do. And so, you know, I think that is a significant help. But back in, when I was prosecutor, especially the last year and a half I was there, when I was prosecuting first and second degree felonies, which meant I was either a victim of a very violent crime, or I even had the decedent, the family of a decedent, if it was a murder case. And even though it didn't pay very well, being a government lawyer doesn't pay well, I got enormous personal satisfaction out of doing the work. But after 5 years there, especially the last year and a half, where I was in trial every single week, which meant I was in trial during the day, I prepped at night, I worked on the weekend to get ready for the next week's, and after a year and a half, I got really burned out and I decided to leave. And in retrospect, I wish I hadn't have done that, because they actually offered to make me the chief of one of the satellite offices, which would have taken me out of a trial division. And, even now I look back and say I should have taken that position because I enjoyed the work, and it would have given me, a year or two of not being in a trial division. And yet I would have had a leadership position in the office, certainly a position that would have been coveted. But I ended up leaving. I went and worked for a family business. I did some defense work. I got married at 34. I was divorced at 35, and I was completely miserable. I was really just not fun to be around. And, the way I sort of filled the void was through fast cars and fast women, right? I was very attracted to the shiny objects that men of the material ilk like me were attracted to. And, it gave me a little bit of a high for a little bit, right? But then the low was lower than perhaps I'd wanted it to be. And I was really miserable. I tried very hard not to practice law. I tried different ways to make a living and it was failed miserably. In '04, I took a year off. I actually moved to DC for a year. I worked on a presidential campaign, and that was very exciting. I ended up becoming part of the legal team. I was part of the advanced team. So I was, especially the last 2 months of the campaign, I was always with the candidate, or the presidential candidate or the vice presidential candidate. I was working with the press. I mean, it was amazing. But the candidate I worked for didn't win, so no job, right? You work on a campaign, you try to get a job afterwards. So no job. I came back to Florida. In 2010, I took what I had left off from the '08 crash, and I ran off to California for 3 years, and basically spent 3 years having a good time. I worked out. I chased more fast women. I also took the bar out there twice. So I had a good friend of mine who also he'd been in South Florida at the same time as me. We went to law schools that were practically neighbors, and he was a public defender when I was prosecutor. He said, why don't you take the bar? We'll open up a criminal defense practice here in Southern California, and we'll just rake in the bucks. And when I took it for the first time, he was taking it for the third time. And ironically, he also had a substance use disorder. So I think I sort of understood him. He took it for the third time. I took it for the first time. I failed it. He passed it. I took it one more time while I was living in California and failed again. After 3 years, I ran out of money. So I came back to Florida. I studied for the California bar one more time while I was here, flew back out, took the exam, and came back. And I failed it a third time. I got within a percentage point this time, but no cigar for me. And then I met somebody that basically changed the course of my life. So I got invited to go to a breakfast presentation. And the presentation was conducted by a guy called R. John Robbins. R. John Robbins founded a company called How to Manage a Small Law Firm. And they teach lawyers about the business side of running a law firm, which is not something they teach any lawyer at any law school anywhere in the country. And I'll be honest, I wasn't even going to go to it because it was like 2 hours south of me, and it was at 7:30 in the morning, which meant I'd have to be up at 4 to get there. And I was like, I was invited by a friend, and I'm like, I'm not getting up at 4 in the morning to hear some guy speak about something I know nothing about, and I've never heard of him anyway. And a couple of days went by, but I can't tell you, I had such a nagging feeling that I needed to go, and it wouldn't go away. And I said, okay, fuck it, I'm going to go. Excuse the language. I'm going to go. And I saw him speak, and it was like the blinkers had been removed. He talked to a group of about 20, 25 lawyers about being an entrepreneurial lawyer. Now, I could relate to that because I had an entrepreneurial father. My dad left school at 14, and my mom left school at 16. They were from London. And, my dad's dad was a tailor, and my mother's father was a barber. So they came from nothing, and they weren't educated either. But my father built businesses. Some worked, some didn't. Some made money, and some he lost his ass on. So when he started talking about the business side of being a lawyer, and these other lawyers looked at him like he had three heads, I was like, this is it. And after he got done speaking, I begged him for a job, and he hired me to work in their sales department. But what I didn't realize, Leon, when I accepted the job was, in addition to learning all about being an entrepreneurial lawyer, what How to Manage really is at their very core is a personal growth company for lawyers. And trust me, if there's any profession that could do with some personal growth, it's most definitely the legal profession. And their underlying philosophy is that financial growth must be preceded by personal growth. And after a year there of obviously learning about how to run a law firm, most importantly, I decided the reason I had been miserable was for two reasons. Number one, I failed to take 100% responsibility for my life, both personally and professionally, right? And number two, the reason I had not enjoyed practicing law for so many years was because I wasn't actually helping anybody, or I didn't feel like I was helping anybody. And in order to really feel that feeling that I had when I was prosecutor and, was living at home with my parents because because they didn't pay very well, I had to find a bunch of people that I could really help. And when I sat down and thought about it, I realized I had some very close family members and friends who had these issues. And after a year there, I decided to go open up my own law firm. And in February of 2016, without any money, I sat myself down in the local library here because I had free Wi-Fi and reasonably decent cheap coffee. And I just started calling people. And I said, I know I haven't been here. I haven't lived in Florida for a long time, and I haven't practiced law in probably at least 5. I said, well, I'm opening up this law firm, and I'd like to tell you about it. And I got, these really, really cheap business cards from Vistaprint. I ran around to treatment centers. I handed out my business cards, and I spoke to anybody and everybody that would listen to me. And it took 14 months before I actually got a call on the kinds of cases that we work on today. So I took other kinds of cases. I represented a student athlete here in Florida who got himself in a bit of hot water with a female student. I took criminal cases. I took family law cases that I co-counseled with a colleague from law school. I would take anything I could to pay bills because I was broke. And 11 months in, I also lost my dad. And 2 months after I buried him, I had a family member that had a bit of a break and got sucked into Florida's mental health system. And so, the work was really close and personal for me. And I really enjoyed not only helping people, but I enjoyed building a business. I was able to get a small office, which ironically we still have, although I don't use it that much because we're virtual these days. I met my wife the second year, so it would have been 2017, and she had a background in guardianship work. And she had practiced up in Massachusetts for about a dozen years with husband number one. And we basically for the next 6 years, so until the end of year 7, it was just the two of us doing everything: the sales, the marketing, meeting with the clients, drafting the pleadings, running to court, you name it, we did it. And so, I took responsibility for the business, but when it comes to the personal side of my life, that took a little bit longer. And so now I'm actually in January, it'll be my second wedding anniversary. So I didn't fully commit to my wife until about 2 years ago. And, I always sort of joke with her that she married me despite my faults, not because of them. So there's now 14 of us. So there's my wife and I plus 12 staff, and we built this amazing business. And, we had our best year ever. We helped a lot of people, and, we've set really big goals for next year because I want to help a lot more people. But this is the happiest I've ever been. And it's not just because I have an amazing business, because I do have an amazing business, but I have an amazing wife. And without her, I couldn't do any of this. I couldn't have built the business without her. I mean, she's really, she's the yin to my yang. And so I went from single life and broke to married with a really successful business, 2 stepchildren, 3 dogs, and 2 kittens, which we just rescued. They're asleep in my office. So it's been one hell of a journey over the last 10 years. But for a long time, I was a real miserable SOB, and I wasn't fun to be around.
And you mentioned mum and dad, and you mentioned one was a tailor and one was a barber, but so they're obviously kind of self-made to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Is that where your drive and your ambition comes from? Because even when you recount that story, I can feel the energy from you. I can feel the push from you. Is that something that's natural? Is it in your family? Like, where's that come from exactly, Mark? 'Cause it's important to know.
Well, look, like I said, my dad came from nothing. He wasn't an educated man. He was street educated, and he built businesses. And I always admired my father's entrepreneurial drive. And I got to tell you, I used to wonder if I had the same drive, and I didn't realize that I had it until I was broke and he was gone. Or, I mean, even for the last year before he died, he was gone, right? He had stroke damage and clearly signs of dementia. It was not a good time. I didn't realize I had it until I was like, okay, we're broke. You're on your butt. What are you going to do? Are you going to cry about it? Or are you going to get up and you're going to fight for the life that you want? And I decided I was going to fight for it. And that's when I realized, I was like, and I said this to my stepson, when it comes to being an entrepreneur and getting the things that you want out of life, either you have that internal drive or you don't. I really think it's God given. I believe that. I think you can teach somebody entrepreneurial skills because I learned them, and I still continue to learn. But you either, I don't know if you've ever seen, is it Rocky 5, when Rocky's outside the restaurant, he's having a really severe chat with his son, who's complaining about his really rotten, his lot in life. And Rocky says, listen, life will put you down. Doesn't matter how tough you are. And it's not about how hard you can hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. Because he said, that's how winning's done. And so, I decided I was going to get up and I was going to fight. And and there are plenty of days I don't feel like getting out of bed, but I do it anyway, because I realize I know where I came from, and I promised myself I'd never go back there. And by building a business, I was able to take care of my mom for the last 7 years. So yeah, I mean, it really is, and that's how winning's done. And it just, I know if you just shut down all the news and all the bullshit that we hear, right? The world is not coming to an end, and it doesn't matter who's in the White House, and it doesn't matter what Congress does. My father was a really big believer in the American dream, Leon. That's why we moved from the UK. He believed that in America, if you work hard, you can still get rewarded. And I believe that was true then, and it's still true now. If you shut out all the noise and stop listening to all the naysayers and people complaining about this, that, and the other, and you go out there and you find a bunch of people that need your help, and you do it to the best of your ability and try to do it better than anybody else, at some point, someone's going to pay you to keep doing it. That's the reward. But you got to you have to have the mission first, and then the money follows, not the other way around. And so for me, it was about finding a group of people that needed our help and building a mission around that. And of course, since we had the firm, we built in certain core values, right? My staff know what the mission of the firm is. And if they're not a good fit for what we're trying to do, then they don't stick around. I think life is about having grit. That's the word I like, grit, right? Because there's been some years where last year was a nightmare for us. We had to get rid of almost all of the staff except for one, because we realized that as much money as it seemed like we were making, the business wasn't running efficiently. And when it wasn't running efficiently, we weren't doing as good a job as I thought we were capable of and taking care of our clients. And so, I had a staff member that decided to quit on a Sunday morning at 9 a.m. And I had to jump back into doing certain things. I had to start, running to court. I had to start doing the sales calls. So, I never asked my staff to do something that I'm not still willing to do and haven't done, 10 times over. But that takes grit. And it also means you got to take responsibility when the business is not going the right direction. Either you're doing something wrong or there's something you're simply not doing. So I take responsibility, but I also say, okay, time to buckle down. The universe is telling me, Mark, you need to work a little harder, right? Maybe you need to work on the weekends instead of sitting on your backside. And so I've got grit and I'm very determined and I'm motivated, but maybe it's because I hit rock bottom and there was no safety net. There was no trust fund to tap into. I mean, there really was nothing there. So, and there's certain things that I want out of life. So got to go get them, got to go fight for them. That's how it's done.
Yeah, you're sort of touching upon kind of leadership as well there, which is not kind of a lot of people get thrust into leadership rather than actually assume the role, but it feels like that you've cultivated that role for yourself and you can lead from the front, but then also you can delegate. Sometimes you can kick arse when you need to as well. But again,
Yeah.
if it's backed up by an ethos and everybody buys into that ethos, then you move together efficiently, right? Rather than leave people behind.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I've had to learn to be a boss as the team has grown. And I think to your point, right, it really is being a good boss is about knowing when to pat him on the back and when to kick him in the ass, right? And when to say to somebody, you did a really good job, well done. And it's also about being willing to call somebody out on their bullshit. I mean, you could do it delicately. I wouldn't call a team member out in front of everybody else. I'd have a private chat with them because there's a way to do it right and a way to do it wrong. But if they're doing something wrong or they didn't do a good job, I got to say, listen, let's talk about that and figure out like how could we have done it better, right? So there's a certain way to deliver the message, and I've had to work on that too. You can't yell and scream at everybody, right? Even though sometimes you want to, right? But I also understand I'm not just responsible for putting food on my table. We have 12 people that work for us. I'm responsible for making sure I can put food on their table too. But you see, they have a family that they care about. They have significant others and children, and they have to come to work every day happy to do so because the work is stressful and we're dealing with emotional people. But I got to make sure that the phone rings enough so that we sell enough legal services and help enough people so they can put food on the table. So it's no longer just about me and my wife. It's about our team too. And I take that responsibility very seriously. But, a couple of weeks ago, we got hired on a case and the following morning there was a hearing. My two associates were jammed up. They were both in hearings. I said, give me the file. And I got up, I don't know, 4 a.m. I drove 4 hours to Sarasota, spent, I don't know, an hour and a half, 2 hours in front of a judge and drove 4 hours back. Client needed us, got to get it done. Right. So instead of saying, I'm not taking the case, I'm not helping this person, I said, okay, I'll do it. Done it before. I'll just have to do it again. And I did it. So the staff know, I'll step up. I have 3 people that work in intake. If they get jammed up, I'll start taking those calls on the weekend. My wife and I were actually in a professionals weekend. We got invited up to see a treatment center and do some training up there. I still took calls. I did what I needed to do to keep things moving and to help the people that need our help. And so, yeah, I mean, I sort of lead by example, and they know that, I'm not going to hear it. They know I'm not going to listen to excuses because they know I'm going to do it. If they don't do it, I'll do it. And that doesn't make me happy because my job is to, at this point is the sales and marketing of the business. I'm the face, right? My wife runs the staff and the systems. So we all have roles to do, in the business. And as it grows, those roles might change a little bit, but I'm not looking to run to court every day. I just don't have the bandwidth for it.
Mm.
So, but if I have to, I will, because that's what it takes to keep the business moving forward.
For you, what does autonomy and dignity look like for somebody who's maybe down on our luck or suffering with addiction? What does that look like for you in real time practice, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, look, most of the time when you've got the patient, the loved one on the other side, at least initially, they're going to fight you, right? They are, because they don't think there's anything wrong with them. They're into complete denial. In fact, they're telling their parents that, mom and dad, you need to go see a psychiatrist. There's something seriously wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm perfectly okay, even though to the outside world, my behavior might seem a little strange. And so I think that part of the initial conversation we want to have with the family, because there's also these feelings of guilt, like they feel guilty, they did something wrong, they were a bad parent, or their loved one we have a bad child. No, no, no. Look, it just happened. You know, it's not because you're a bad parent or because they're a bad person or they were a bad child when they were growing up. It's a no judgment zone. It's not about like who's at fault. It's about how do we move things forward. So I think it's at least during the initial conversation, Leon, you got to maybe take the pressure off the family because part of the fighting that's going on between mom and dad is, well, whose fault was this? You were a lousy father. You were a lousy mother. Oh, your mother used to drink. That's why our son's an alcoholic, right? It's not about that. And maybe it's true, right? Maybe one of them was a lousy parent, but that we can't change that. Okay. And so it's about taking the pressure off of the family, letting them know that they're in a no judgment zone and it's okay. Right. And also look, we've spoken to thousands of families over the last 10 years and letting them know they're not alone. And while their situation may be on the facts unique, because every case is unique, there are other families out there who are suffering. Right. And so I think when they realize that, they say, whew, okay, we thought this was only happening to us, right? Because of the stigma, they never really shared it with anybody, right? And so they felt like they were suffering in not only alone, but like in secrecy. They wanted to paint the picture they were the perfect family, and deep down they were all in crisis. Their loved one, the parents, the siblings, all of them. So I think it's about letting them know, look, we're here to support you, and here's some resources that we can use just to get the family, back in a stable situation, and with regards to their loved one, on the occasion I do get to speak to somebody, normally they're not very nice to me. And this is when I used to go to court and I'd be there with the parents. And then like 3 months later, when we were back in court, it was like a different person. They were
Mm.
like, "Whew, thank you for saving me. I really appreciate it." It was like the light bulb went on. And so I think that's what motivates me, to be honest with you. But look, these things take time. I mean, someone's been sick for 5 or 10 years. Fixing that in a month, it just doesn't happen. Not in the real world. It's 3 to 6 months of serious treatment, and then they got to work a continuum of care. And I tell every family, look, this is a year-long journey. You don't have to hire me for a year, but we're looking a year down the road here for your loved one and you. But I think that once the roadmap's laid out, I think folks realize there's hope. And that's what I'm really selling. I'm selling hope, right? I'm not selling a magic potion. And if you work the program, hey, we got a great chance to save this person. If you don't, then this is going to continue. It's going to get worse because it's like any disease. If it's untreated, it will eventually destroy the host.
Hmm. Yeah, I can think of sort of family members coming to you almost like a last hope, and then you fulfilling a role that's almost social worker, it's a bit of psychologist, a bit of therapist, it's a bit listening, it's a bit being a ventilation point and let somebody, I suppose, spew out traumatic events in service a loved one. And then you make a great point there as well, Mark, about the length of time that people put into their addiction. And what I mean by that really directly is I'd been in rehab for maybe about 10 weeks. And I was full of what we call in this country pink clouds. So I could change the world by then. I'd straightened up. I wasn't using my medication anymore. I wasn't using my substance of choice. You know, everything was rosy in the garden. I was ready to take on the world. Bang, bang, bang.
Hmm.
And this clinical psychologist stopped me and he said, how long were you in active addiction for? I was like 17 years. And he was like, and how long you been off drugs and off medication? I was like 10 weeks. And he just done this with his hands. And I was like, shut my mouth. I didn't speak to anybody all day. Got a proper kind of ego death bottom lip about it. But it speaks to that point directly, Mark, right? Is that a lot of times you're going to need a good 12, 16 weeks just to reset before the emotions come and the identity restructure. And then when you stop all that, like, what am I going to do next? Am I going to get a job? Am I going to study? Like, all that's yet to come. And yeah, I felt that at the sharp end directly to your point, Mark, just to be clear about that.
I appreciate you sharing that because, a lot of sometimes will call me and say, well, I just want to put him into treatment for 30 days, or I just want to put her into treatment for 30 days. I'm like, then you got the wrong lawyer.
Yeah.
And they're like, why is that? I'm like, because they're going to do 30 days and on day 31, they're going to relapse. How do you know that? Well, because I've spoken to several thousand families over the years and I know how long it takes. And I think if you're only looking to do this for 30 days, I'm not going to take your case. I'm not going to waste your time or, frankly, your money because I know where this is going to go. If you want to have a conversation with us about what it looks like to work with us and what the plan of action is going to be, yeah, I'm happy to help you. And I've got a lot of free resources and you can gladly send all of you all the free resources. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to have a different conversation about what the recovery process looks like. And if that doesn't work for you, okay, it's a no judgment zone. I'm just not the right lawyer for you because I want to save your family. I don't want to sell you false hope because I know where this goes.
Yeah.
So it's about having an honest conversation too. And the other thing, Leon, is some families are just not ready. They're like, I'm not going into court. I don't want to be in front of a judge. I don't want to have to testify against my own family member. Okay, then what else can we do? Is it possible to do an intervention? Because I'm a fan of interventions, with the right qualified interventionist, and so sometimes that's okay, right? And if that's what the family wants, then I'm not going to push them to do something they're not comfortable with. But interventions are a great way to get somebody to treatment. What we do is a way to keep them in treatment. And again, it's just a matter of what the family wants and what have they tried, what has worked, what hasn't worked. If you've done an intervention twice and it didn't work, then maybe third time's a charm, but maybe the past is a good judge of what's going to happen in the future. But I'm certainly happy to go down that road. But it's about giving families options and having an honest conversation with them and not blowing smoke up their backside and telling them something that's just simply not going to happen.
Yeah. We're not here to sell dreams. I think it's the important thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's not what I do.
And I'm going to land directly on the Baker Act because before we made contact, Mark, I'll be honest, I'd never heard of the Baker Act. And at first in my head, I kind of formulated in my head that it was something like the Mental Capacity Act in this country as well. But I've had a real surface level read. It's not that directly. So just for our listeners, can you just give us a quick overview or synopsis on what the Baker Act actually is, please, Mark?
Yeah, so it's called the Baker Act because it was named after somebody whose last name was Baker. But here in Florida, it's Section 394 of the Florida statutes, and it's the statute that allows the state of Florida to basically take custody of somebody, make somebody a ward of the state. So now the state is the legal guardian when, as a result of some type of mental illness, they pose an immediate danger to themselves, i.e., they're probably suicidal, or they took, either they are suicidal or they actually did something to try and harm themselves. They cut their wrists, they took way too much medication, they did something to self-harm. And what happens is the state can step in and basically grab somebody and lock them up, restrict their liberty for an initial period of up to 72 hours. And just about every state has some version of the Baker Act. And I'm pretty sure the UK has something like that too, where, if you pick up the phone and I guess they call it we call it 911, you call it is it 999 in England? In the UK?
That's right.
Yeah, it's been a long time. But right, if you call the phone and pick up the phone and say, hey, listen, I need officers here now because somebody's actively suicidal, they can come down and the police who are agents of not only the state's criminal system, but the mental health system, and they can take custody of the person and take them to a designated licensed facility that hopefully can provide them with some immediate services. The problem here in Florida is that not only is the mental health system completely draconian and broken, but the big problem with the Baker Act is that once you get sucked into Florida's mental health system, nobody actually knows you're there. And what I mean by that is that there's no oversight. So if I get taken to a facility, that facility is not monitored. There's nobody watching what happens. So, I mean, if you get arrested here in Florida and you can't post bond, you get taken to the county jail. Within 24 hours, you go to see a judge, right? Who, makes sure that the arrest was legal, talks to you about getting counsel, and figures out a way to release you with reasonable conditions, right? So you've been arrested, you get to see a judge within 24 hours and speak to a lawyer. Well, if you get Baker Acted here in Florida, you don't get any of that, which seems completely arse backwards because you haven't done anything wrong. In fact, you're in crisis, and yet nobody's monitoring the situation. I mean, there is due process built into this thing where you eventually get to see a judge, but that only happens one of two ways. Either I drag them into court because they're holding this person illegally and violating their constitutional and statutory rights, or the facility files something trying to keep the person, potentially up to 6 months. And so it's very easily abused. I mean, I file at least 150 cases every single year to get people out of the mental health system. I think this year, now I think about it, it's probably closer to 200. We've been really busy this year. Florida sucks about 100,000 people every year into the mental health system. Some of them get sent to a state hospital. I mean, some of them get released. It's just a matter of how long you're going to get stuck there. And so that's become a bit of a mission of mine. But, when it's done correctly, yeah, it's a life-saving tool. But it's got its pluses and minuses. And sometimes somebody gets worse, not better, when they get Baker Acted.
Yeah, in this country, you've got deprivation of liberties, which is kind of associated with the Mental Capacity Act. But again, I think the oversight and regulation is probably the difference comparatively to the Baker Act. As you say, it's worrying that there's no oversight in that. And I can imagine some people who maybe don't have support networks around them or family members willing to put in that sort of advocacy work, or then come from like really poor or underprivileged backgrounds on top, and then hit certain race intersections. You've got a minefield of people who are kind of falling through gaps. Is that a fair assumption, Mark?
Yeah. I mean, what happens if they don't have the funds to go hire a private lawyer? Well, at that point, they got to hope that the facility actually does file to keep them, because once that happens, the court is going to at least appoint a public defender to represent them, which is a free lawyer. But, and I say this with all due respects to the public defender's office. In fact, Corey, one of my associates, I actually hired him out of the public defender's office because he was handling these cases as court-appointed counsel. But the problem is, if we go into court and there's a hearing, we have one case on the docket. That's yours. Public defender goes on the docket. They have 20 or 25 other cases. So it's kind of not fair, right? I mean, you've got the public defender who's swamped with cases. And how can they really do a bang-up job? I mean, they're just trying to move the cases at this point. We go in, we're going into fight. Occasionally I'll resolve a case without a hearing, but it's got to be very favorable to the client, and the benefit has to outweigh the risk. If we're not going to litigate the case, most of the time we're going to fight because the person's being held illegally. But if the facility decides not to file, and they just decide they want to keep you without a hearing, they can do it, and they do it, and they'll forcibly medicate you to render you catatonic. And some of these facilities are really bad. Really bad.
Oh, it's making me even wince thinking about that when you spell it out in real terms. And I don't want you to breach privacy or blur any boundaries, but is there a case that really sort of crystallizes what's wrong with how we're approaching, I suppose, mental health or the Baker Act? Is there something that really sticks out at you, or is there too many to mention, or what's your takeaway on that, Mark?
No, in fact, it's ironic. We just had a case, and this is a bit of a sad situation. Kind of, we're passionate in the office about helping veterans here because I think this country does a really crappy job of taking care of veterans. And my father-in-law is also a veteran, so we're passionate about that, and we really like to help the veterans. But we had a call from a lady. Her husband had been Baker Acted. Apparently, he'd actually attempted suicide, and I know that is very prevalent in the in the veteran community because we don't take care of them after they go and fight for us. And he'd been taken to the VA for medical attention, and then they sent him to a facility, a behavioral health facility. Well, the facility kept him way past the time they should keep him. They didn't care. He had veterans, he had veterans insurance. Well, veterans insurance is great for these facilities because it's Uncle Sam, and Uncle Sam, when it comes to this aspect, tends to pay his bills. So they were getting paid, and they didn't care that they were holding him illegally and they violated his rights. So we filed the case. My understanding is that he's getting released today, which is a great thing. But he was held way past the time he should be held. So I mean, it's just an example of some of the things that we see. But it's so easily abused, Leon. It's shocking. It really, really is. And sometimes, most of these cases originate because police get called to the scene. And sometimes, what's the old saying? I'd rather be punished for what I did do than what I didn't do. And so sometimes the police will Baker Act somebody even when the criteria aren't there because they don't want to take a chance that, well, if they leave, something terrible might happen. Well, something terrible might happen, but, if the criteria is not present, what are you doing locking the person up?
Yeah.
Because something terrible can happen in a Baker Act facility too. I've had people that were beaten up. I had a woman that was raped. I mean, really horrendous stuff. So it's not a perfect system, but if we had some kind of monitoring, then that would change things. Because if facilities knew that a judge was watching over them, and they could be sued, because here in Florida they enjoy sovereign immunity because they're agents of the state, so you can't sue them for this stuff either. Then, yeah, maybe it would change.
Interesting. We're looking for, I suppose, a humanitarian response in the face of rampant capitalism, but there's a kind of socio-political aspect to that as well. Now I say it out loud, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Baker Act's a cash cow for some of these facilities. It is, and I'm not saying they shouldn't be paid, but you shouldn't be paid if you do it illegally.
Yeah. That's
Right? You shouldn't have a windfall. You're there to help people. Right? The Baker Act is supposed to be a shield, not a sword.
So I'm going to come back to you specifically, and you're working with families. You've got high impact cases. You're driving all over the country. Sometimes you're being a leader. You're empowering people. Like, that comes with exposure to distress. It exposes you to trauma, fear. Like, how do you personally manage that emotional toll without slipping back into that sort of that burnout phase that you mentioned earlier in your career, or being cynical, Mark? Like, how do you manage that self-care piece? Because that's really important to know, I feel.
Yeah, and it did start to wear me down. I think one of the things I did was I actually stopped working on the weekends. I just had to. I stopped working 7 days a week because it was starting to have an effect on me physically as well as mentally. The last couple of months we've opened back up on the weekends, partly because I have staff that can work the weekends now, so I don't have to do everything. But I will tell you, I mean, I still probably work 6 days a week. And I think, was it a couple of weeks ago, I had a call that came to on a Sunday morning, 7 o'clock. I took the call. And they hired us, and I ended up doing the work too, much to my wife's chagrin. But she's supportive because she knows this is what, gets me out of bed in the morning. So I try to be careful. We're actually taking 10 days off in December, taking my wife on a cruise.
Nice.
But we now have a real structure in place, and we'll see if I can disconnect for those 10 days. I think if I don't, my wife might throw me overboard or divorce me. So I'm going to really try my best to disconnect. But I think one of the things I struggle with, Leon, is this whole idea that, well, it's my baby and nobody can do it as well as me. And that's simply not true.
Yeah.
The two lawyers I have on hand, they're equally as good as me, if not a little better. They don't have my experience, but when it comes to being in the courtroom, they're dynamite. And I have a well-oiled sales machine. We brought in a chief operating officer to help us, really systematize the business so it runs much smoother. So I've got all these wonderful things going on, and I wonder if I could go away for 10 days and not actually check my email or not check to see, what's come in through the front door. We'll have to see. I've never been able to do that yet. So, but I think I really need to, not just because I'm taking my wife away, but because I think for my own sanity, I got to be able to disconnect. But it's tough when I see the phone, I see the calls coming in. I want to know that they're getting handled, and as a general, they are. So I have to delegate and allow my staff to do their job. And as a mentor of mine once told me, a B plus is good enough. It doesn't have to necessarily be an A, meaning they can do the job well enough, right? Is it as good as me? Maybe, maybe not. Can we still get the job done well enough so that we take care of our clients? I think that we can. Otherwise, if I'm going to be a perfectionist, I'll never be able to hire anybody. We'll never be able to grow the business. I'll never be able to help anybody because
Of course.
it's got to be me. If it's not me, we're nobody. That's just a ridiculous way to look at things. So,
Yeah.
and we have to have some quality controls in place, which we're working on to make sure the work is done correctly. And for the most part, it is. My staff, really do buy into the mission and the core values of the business.
Well, yeah,
I'm a work in progress like everybody else.
that's a mantra you need to tell yourself, to delegate, 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 but right. And we're coming towards the dessert sections. Yeah, we're coming to the sorbet after the meat platter, if you will. And if you imagine a future where the system actually works, so maybe a future on the light end of the spectrum, what does that look like? Spell that out for us so that we can see what the aspiration is here.
Yeah, I think, we have our 3 offices in Florida. We cover the state now. I would like to open up offices in different parts of the country because, in order for us to do what we do, Leon, while our clients, the parents, are typically out of state, their loved one either has to be in Florida, coming to Florida, or we have to figure out how to get them here to Florida. Most of the time, we're able to do that by hook or by crook. But obviously, that limits us a little bit, right? Now, if I had an office in Texas and they were in Texas, and I didn't have to worry about getting them to Florida, right? And I could get an order in a Texas court, right, which would either give us the authority to bring them here to Florida or send them to treatment in Texas because Texas has good treatment too. That would change things, right? Now I can help all those people in Texas or New York or wherever it happens to be. And I think, that is definitely a 2026 project for us, is to get an office in another state. And I don't know what that looks like. Again, we're putting all the pieces together, but I think we're ready to do that. We certainly will be in the first quarter of the year in 2026. So I think that's part of the grand plan, is to try and help more people. That means we have to have offices in different parts of the country, and I'm going to have to trust lawyers in different parts of the country to do it as well as we do it, which means I have to give them the instruction manual, right? It's like McDonald's. You go get a McDonald's franchise and they give you this whole book, right, on how long to cook the burger for, how to make a Big Mac and all this stuff, right? They tell you how it needs to be done, so it looks like a Big Mac and not something you just threw together. And so we're going to have to create a playbook so that that somebody who's doing it in Texas does it as well as we do it in Florida. And we also have to give them the support system, right? I have to have the marketing so I can drive them traffic, drive them business. And so we'll probably centralize all that. We'll probably take all the sales calls here, and we have to help them with their business because, as I said at the beginning, they don't teach lawyers anywhere in the US. It doesn't matter where you went to school, where I went in South Florida or Harvard. They do not teach lawyers how to run a law firm business. And so we're going to have to help them with that because otherwise it'll become a mess and they won't be able to help the client. And at the end of the day, it's about helping the client and saving their family. So we have all these things we have to put together, but I think I really want to see how many more people can we help? Because if we're going to help people all over the country, then we'll need offices all over the country. We'll see what that looks like. And I think that's the grand plan. But, everything seems to take, everything takes longer than you would ever plan for, right? If you said it'll take 6 months, it'll take at least a year. That's business. That's life. That's life.
Yeah, I think if you keep that drive and motivation that I can feel an ocean apart and sort of that mission and the values and the ethos, if you can keep that, there's a good start for any playbook for anybody who wants to follow or work alongside you. And just as a sort of landing piece, what do you wish more people understood about addiction, mental health, and the people going through it based on your experience? Because I think that would be a nice place to kind of leave it as a little bit of advice coming from your specialized place.
Well, I think first of all, don't judge them, right? Don't say, oh, that's a bad person. Look at the choices they make. Because I mean, we've all made bad choices. I mean, I spent at least 10 years making horrible choices, and it's part of my journey, which I share with you. But first of all, we can't judge people, right? Because there by the grace of God go I. That's number one. Number two, it's a disease, right? Nobody chooses to get sick. Nobody chooses to have a substance use disorder or a behavioral health issue. And so understanding that, when you understand it's a disease, then it's less about, well, they decided to live this way. So, shame on them, right? So I think that's important. The other thing is, I think you have to have empathy for the families, because what's going on is the reason we focus on the family is because it's the family that's really ultimately being destroyed by what's going on inside. And so, it's about having empathy for families, but it's also about being honest with them too, and saying, look, I think this is what we need to do. Right. And if they decide not to, okay, again, we're not going to judge them if they decide not to do it for whatever the reason may be. But I think it's easy to just stand in judgment of somebody. I mean, we become a society where it's like if people who have different political affiliations, you know, they're the enemy all of a sudden, right? I mean, they're not, right? They just have a different set of beliefs, and that's okay.
Sometimes it's good to block out all the bullshit and remember actually the inherent
Yeah,
good.
it's hard to avoid all the noise, right? It really is. But I think if you can cut out as much as you can cut out and just focusing on what your mission is, I think things will be okay.
Yeah, we're going to be all right. And that brings me to closing. So, Mark, thanks for taking us through both the light and the dark today. Your work pushes me
Thanks, man.
to rethink not just systems, but humanity, dignity, and the messy reality of crisis. For our listeners who want to dive deeper into Mark's mission or get support, I'm going to put a load of links into the show notes. And as always, thanks for joining us on Too Light, Too Dark, where we believe that every story holds both contrast and truth. So until next time, stay curious, stay open, and take care of both your shadows and your shine. Namaste, Mark. Thank you so much.
Namaste.